The cold was the first thing to steal her breath. It was a bleak, gray morning, the kind that promised nothing but more of the same. The air in the yard smelled of wet wood smoke and the sharp tang of an impending snow, a heavy, metallic weight against her lungs. Clara stood by the gate, her hands worrying the thin wool of her shawl. She was 22 years old, and her life was over. Her father did not look at her. He stood talking to the ranch hand, a man named Shaw, whose face was lost in a thick beard grizzled with ice. "Mr." Shaw was checking the harness on the wagon team, his movements efficient and indifferent. He was here for cargo. Clara's bag, a meager canvas satchel holding 2 shifts and a worn Bible she no longer read, sat in the frozen mud by the wagon wheel. Beside it, her father handed Mr. Shaw a folded piece of paper, a receipt, a settlement of debt. "She works," her father said. His voice clipped. He finally turned his gaze on her, and Clara felt the familiar clench of shame deep in her belly. His eyes were flat, like slate chips. "She's strong enough for chores. Just don't expect anything else from her." "Mr." Shaw grunted, pocketing the paper. "He knows the terms." "Useless for what matters," her mother had screeched last night, packing the bag herself, her fingers pinching Clara's arm. "Barren! Cursed!" The word echoed in the yard, though it had not been spoken aloud this morning. Barren. It was the name they had given her trauma. It was the stone they had tied to her feet before pushing her into the river of her own life. No one spoke of the incident itself. They never mentioned her cousin, or the steep angle of the cellar stairs, or the weeks she had spent bleeding in the dark, the life draining out of her before it had ever truly begun. They only spoke of the result, the silence in her womb, the failure that made her worthless as a wife, worthless as a woman. "Get in the wagon! Clara!" her father ordered, jerking his chin toward the conveyance. She did not cry. The tears had frozen inside her months ago. She picked up her satchel, the rope handle biting into her fingers, and walked to the wagon. "Mr." Shaw did not help her up. She hauled herself over the sideboard, her worn boots slipping on the frosted wood, and settled onto the hard bench. She did not look back. She heard the snap of the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, throwing her against the side. The gate of the small, mean farm where she had been born disappeared behind the falling snow. They traveled for 3 days. The journey was a blur of gray misery, a descent into an endless frozen expanse. They moved west, climbing higher toward the Bitterroot Mountains, a jagged spine of rock that tore at the sky. The wind never stopped. It screamed through the gaps in the wagon cover, driving needles of snow into Clara's face until her skin was raw and numb. "Mr." Shaw spoke only to his mules. He stopped twice a day to feed them and to build a small, smoky fire, over which he boiled coffee and fried salt pork. He offered her portions without ceremony, and she ate them without appetite. The cold was so deep it seemed to have settled in her bones, a permanent ache that thrummed in time with the rattling wheels. She slept huddled under a thin blanket, her knees drawn to her chest, trying to steal warmth from the mule's body heat radiating through the wagon bed. She did not dream. She existed in a state of suspended terror, a dread so profound it had become boredom. She was property, passed from one ledger to another. She was moving from a place where she was hated to a place where she was simply nothing. On the 3rd afternoon, the snow lessened, and the wagon descended into a high valley. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. The mountains crowded in on all sides, their peaks white and hostile. The valley floor was a wide bowl, covered in deep drifts, broken only by the dark, skeletal shapes of pine and cottonwood. The ranch was not a ranch, not as she understood it. It was a cabin, a barn, and a few corrals, all built of dark, rough-hewn logs, looking small and defiant against the looming white backdrop. A thread of smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, the only sign of life. "Mr." Shaw pulled the team to a halt near the cabin porch. "We're here." Clara sat still, her limbs stiff and slow. She slid over the edge of the wagon, her legs buckling slightly as her feet hit the packed snow. The silence was immense. The cabin door opened. The man who emerged was tall, broader than any man she had ever seen up close. He filled the doorway, a solid block of shadow against the dim light within. He wore heavy wool trousers and a thick shirt. The sleeves rolled up his forearms despite the biting cold. He was, she guessed, in his late 30s, but his face was hard-bitten, carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded him. His dark hair was overgrown, and a thick beard covered his jaw, but it was his eyes that held her. They were gray, and utterly, terrifyingly hollow. This was Jeremiah McAllister, the widower, the man who had paid her father's debt. He looked at Mr. Shaw, not at Clara. The journey was hard. "Snowed all the way from the divide," Shaw said, stamping his feet. "But she's here, as agreed." Jeremiah McAllister's empty gaze finally fell on Clara. It passed over her, assessing her the way he might assess a new heifer, checking for lameness, for weakness. She flinched, pulling her shawl tighter, expecting a comment, a critique. He said nothing. He looked back at Shaw. "I'll settle up with you for the transport. Put the team in the barn. There's feed and whiskey inside." "Appreciated." "McAllister." Shaw nodded and led the mules away. Clara was left alone in the snow, standing before the silent, broad-shouldered man. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The wind picked up, whipping her hair across her face. "You sleep in the loft," he said. His voice was a low rasp, rough as gravel, as if he rarely used it. He gestured with his head toward the cabin. "The kitchen is your work. I take my meals at dawn and at dusk. Do not let the fire go out." He turned and went back inside, leaving the door open for her. She followed, her heart a cold knot in her chest. The cabin was one large room, dark and heavy with the smell of stale whiskey, wood smoke, and curing meat. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A bed, unmade, was shoved into a corner. It was a man's space, stark and untended. He was standing by the fire, poking it with an iron rod. He did not look up as she entered. "The loft ladder is there." She saw it, crude wooden rungs nailed to the wall, leading to a dark opening above. She moved toward it, her satchel clutched in her hand. "Do not speak unless spoken to," he said to the fire. "Yes, sir," she whispered. She climbed the ladder. The loft was low-ceilinged, cold, and filled with shadows. It smelled of dust and dried herbs. A simple straw pallet lay on the floorboards. It was there, in the frigid dark, that Clara dropped her bag, sank onto the pallet, and let the first tears of the journey trace burning tracks down her frozen cheeks. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking. She cried not for the family she had lost, for they had never been hers. She cried because she had expected cruelty, a hard hand or a harsh voice. She had prepared herself for that. She had not prepared for this. She had not prepared for the crushing weight of indifference. She was not a person to him. She was a pair of hands to work the kitchen, a body to fill a space, less important than the fire he tended. Down below, she heard the clink of a bottle against a tin cup. She heard him settle into his chair. She waited, rigid, for the sound of his heavy boots on the ladder, for the demand her father's debt implied. She waited for the cruelty to begin. But the steps never came. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the steady, lonely sound of a man drinking in the dark. The days that followed were a regimen of hard, freezing labor. Clara learned the boundaries of her new life quickly. Her world was the cabin, the woodpile, and the chicken coop. Jeremiah McAllister lived outside those boundaries. He was gone before she came down from the loft at dawn, and he returned well after dusk. smelling of pine, gunpowder, and horse. She rose in the black cold, her breath pluming in the loft. She would climb down the ladder, her blistered hands stinging as they gripped the rough wood. The main room would be frigid. Her first task was always the fire, coaxing the embers back to life, adding kindling she had split the day before. Her hands, soft from a life of mending and indoor chores, were ruined within a week. The blisters broke, bled, and formed new, weeping sores. She hauled water from the well, fighting the frozen crank. The rope stiff as iron, the buckets were heavy, and the water sloshed, freezing instantly to her skirt. She fed the half-dozen chickens in their small coop, their clucking the only friendly sound in the valley. She cooked salt pork, beans, hard biscuits. She would leave his plate on the table at dusk and retreat to the loft, hearing him enter the cabin below as she tried to sleep. She mended his clothes. Heavy canvas trousers ripped by thorns, wool shirts worn thin at the elbows. She worked by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, her fingers numb, the needle clumsy. At night, the wind howled. It was a living thing, a predator that clawed at the chinking between the logs and screamed down the chimney. It was the sound of utter isolation. Clara felt as if she were the only woman left in the world, trapped in a cold box with a silent, grieving ghost. Jeremiah never spoke to her. He left his empty plates on the table. He provided wood for the stove and flour for the bin. He was a presence, defined by the heavy tread of his boots and the smell of whiskey that clung to him late at night. He drank, she realized, with a grim determination. One afternoon, a week into her arrival, she was splitting kindling by the cabin wall. Her hands ached, and the axe was heavy, hard to aim. She was clumsy, and the cold made her muscles slow. She looked up, sensing him, and saw him standing by the barn, watching her. He had been there for some time. She froze, expecting him to yell at her for her incompetence. He walked over, took the axe from her trembling hands without a word, and in 10 minutes of swift, brutal motion, reduced a large log to a mountain of perfect kindling. He dropped the axe and walked away, disappearing into the trees with his rifle. Clara stared at the woodpile, her face burning with a shame that had nothing to do with her barrenness. She saw the graves 2 days later. She had followed a chicken that had escaped its run, chasing it toward a small stand of aspen trees 100 yards from the cabin. And there they were, 2 simple wooden markers, tilting slightly in the frozen earth. One was taller, the name carved deep, Mary McAllister. The other was small, barely more than a slat of wood, half buried in a drift, Eliza. Clara stopped, her breath catching. She looked back at the cabin, suddenly understanding the hollowness in the man's eyes, the crushing silence of the house. He had not just lost a wife, he had lost a child. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding. She felt like a trespasser, as if she had read a private letter. She did not belong here, in this place of such profound grief. That night, she saw him there. The moon was high, casting a stark blue light on the snow. Clara had woken from a fitful sleep, driven by the cold to seek the residual warmth of the wood stove downstairs. She was halfway down the ladder when she saw the cabin was empty. The door was ajar. She looked out the small, frosted window. She saw his dark shape, a smudge against the snow, standing over the 2 markers. He was hatless, his head bowed. Even from this distance, she could see the bottle in his hand. He was swaying slightly, drunk and alone, talking to the frozen ground. Clara retreated up the ladder, her hands shaking. She lay on her pallet, pulling the thin blanket to her chin, and listened to the wind. She kept her distance. She understood, better than most, that some sorrows were too deep to bear witness to. The first visitor arrived near the end of her 2nd week. A woman on a sturdy gray mare rode into the yard, leading a pack mule. Clara, who was sweeping the porch, froze. "Hello, the house," the woman called. She was older, perhaps 50, wrapped in thick furs, her face rud. DY from the wind. Clara did not know the protocol. She glanced toward the barn, but Jeremiah was gone. The woman dismounted with a grunt. "Well, you must be the new one. I'm Mrs. Gable. I live down valley, about 10 miles. She stomped the snow off her boots. "Figured you'd be here by now. Brought some preserves." Jeremiah McAllister ain't fit to feed a stray dog, let alone a woman. Clara nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, ma'am." "Mrs." Gable looked her up and down, her eyes sharp and assessing. You're younger than I pictured, and thin. This place will either put meat on your bones or break you in two." She pushed past Clara and entered the cabin, setting a crate on the table. "Lord, it's dark as a tomb in here." She began unpacking jars. "I suppose you know what you've gotten into." Clara said nothing, just stood in the doorway. "He's a hard man. Jeremiah." "Mrs." Gable continued, not seeming to need a response. "Harder since he lost Mary and the baby. Fever took them, 2 days apart. Awful thing, just awful. Broke him. He ain't been right since." She paused and looked directly at Clara, her gaze softening just a fraction. "And you're that Barren girl from down south, ain't you? The one whose family sold her off?" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The words were not cruel, just fact. Her label had traveled faster than the wagon. "Don't you mind me." "Mrs." Gable said, turning back to the jars. "Word gets around. Even up here. Folks are talking, of course, saying he's just lonely enough to take in damaged goods. And you're just desperate enough to come?" Clara winced. Damaged goods. "Pay them no mind." "Mrs." Gable said gruffly. "Folks got nothing better to do than wag their tongues. You just do the work, keep your head down. Maybe you two broken pieces can make a whole. Stranger things have happened." She finished her delivery, gave Clara a final, pitying look, and left. Clara watched her ride away until she was just a dot against the snow. She was that Barren girl. He was the man lonely enough to take her in. She leaned against the doorframe, the cold seeping into her back, and felt a despair deeper than any she had yet known. That night, the cold snapped, the temperature plummeted, and the wind returned with a vengeance. Jeremiah stayed out late, later than usual. When he returned, he brought with him 2 rabbits, stiff and frozen, slung over his shoulder. He dropped them on the kitchen sideboard. "Skin these," he ordered. Clara stared at them. She had plucked chickens, but this was different. The small, dead eyes, the frozen blood on the fur, but she nodded, her stomach rolling. He went to the fire, poured his customary cup of whiskey, and sat down, his back to her. Clara took the hunting knife from the wall. Her hands were shaking, partly from cold, partly from disgust. The rabbit was rigid. She struggled to make the first cut, the knife slipping on the frozen hide. She gripped it tighter, forcing the blade, her knuckles white. The knife slid, glanced off a bone, and buried its tip in the flesh of her left palm. It was a deep, clean cut. Clara gasped, a sharp intake of breath, and dropped the knife. It clattered on the wood floor. Blood, dark and immediate, welled up and spilled over her hand, dripping onto the rabbit's white fur. Before she could even move to grab a rag, he was there. He had crossed the room in 2 strides, silent as a shadow. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was iron, stopping her instinctive flinch. He held her hand up to the lantern light, examining the wound. His hollow eyes were focused, sharp. Clara braced herself. She waited for the curse, the slap for her clumsiness, for ruining the meat. He said nothing. He kept hold of her wrist and turned, pulling her toward the dry sink. With his free hand, he pumped water over the cut, washing away the blood. The water was icy, and she hissed in pain, but he held her steady. He let her go only to open a tin on a high shelf. He pulled out a roll of clean linen and a small brown bottle of carbolic. He poured the stinging liquid directly into the cut. Clara cried out, pulling back, but he grabbed her hand again, his grip unbreakable. "Hold still," he commanded. It was the first time he had spoken to her in days, other than to give an order. He wrapped the linen tightly around her palm, his large, rough fingers surprisingly precise. He tied it off, his movements economical and sure. The whole thing took less than a minute. He let go. The sudden absence of his grip left her hand feeling cold, despite the throbbing heat of the wound. Clara stood there, trembling, looking at the neat white bandage. She looked up at him. He was staring at her hand, his face set in the same hard lines, but his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, were different. The hollowness was gone, replaced by something else, a glint of sharp, clear concern. It was not pity, it was not anger. It was the look of a man seeing an injury that needed tending. He saw her looking, the expression vanished, and the mask of indifference slammed back down. He turned away from her. "Finish the other rabbit," he said, his voice flat. He picked up the bloody knife, wiped it on his trousers, and set it back on the sideboard. He went back to his chair, picked up his whiskey, and faced the fire. Clara stood by the sink, her bandaged hand pressed to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had not hurt her. He had helped her. She looked at the second rabbit, the dread returning, but it was muted now. She took a breath and picked up the knife with her right hand. Later that night, as she lay in the loft, the wind screaming outside, she pressed her bandaged hand to her cheek. The linen smelled faintly of carbolic and the clean, masculine scent of his skin. For the first time since she had arrived in this frozen, desolate valley, Clara Monroe slept, and she was not entirely afraid. The snow did not vanish overnight. It was a slow, agonizing retreat. For weeks, the valley was trapped between winter's grip and spring's promise. The world began to weep. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin, a steady, maddening rhythm that replaced the howl of the wind. The packed snow in the yard turned to a thick, gray slurry that sucked at Clara's boots. The creek, silent for months, began to roar, a hungry sound that spoke of movement and change. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive, sealed-in silence of winter was broken by the sound of the land waking up. Jeremiah was outside more, his days consumed by the immediate needs of a ranch emerging from ice. The roof of the barn needed patching where the weight of the snow had cracked a beam. The melt revealed the true state of his fences, long sections flattened by drifts or broken by fallen trees. Clara's world, too, expanded. The chickens were let out of their coop, and she was tasked with mending the enclosure. The work required sturdier clothing than her too thin dresses. Jeremiah said nothing, but one morning she found a large, cedar-lined trunk left by the hearth, the latch unlocked. She opened it with trembling hands. The smell that rose from it was not of dust or mildew, but of dried lavender and thyme. It was Mary's. Clara's breath hitched. She felt like a grave robber. Inside were neatly folded clothes, wool skirts, heavier and better made than her own, flannel shirts, a dark green riding habit, and on top, a thick shawl, woven from dark blue wool, soft and impossibly heavy. She lifted it. It was clean, preserved. To wear it felt like a violation. But the cold was a more immediate reality than her guilt. Her own shawl was thin, offering no protection against the damp, biting air. She looked toward the door, where Jeremiah was harnessing his horse, his back to her. She draped the heavy blue shawl over her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a heavy, comforting weight. She buried her face in it for just a second, inhaling the faint scent of another woman, a woman who had been loved in this cabin, a woman who had belonged. She went outside, her hands clenched in the folds of the wool. Jeremiah turned, leading the horse from the corral. His eyes swept over her, stopped at the shawl. His face, always hard, seemed to crack for just a second. His jaw tightened, and a muscle worked beneath his beard. He stared at the blue wool on her shoulders as if it were a ghost. Clara froze, ready to tear it off, to apologize. He said nothing. He turned his back, swung up into the saddle, and rode out toward the south pasture without a word. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding. His silence was its own kind of permission, a concession that the living had needs the dead could no longer claim. She wore the shawl every day after that. The ranch demanded more than one pair of hands. Jeremiah had managed alone through the winter, but the thaw revealed a backlog of work that would crush a single man. He began to give Clara responsibilities beyond the kitchen and the chicken coop. It started without words. He was stretching new wire on a fence line, and the spool was heavy, fighting him. He grunted in frustration. Clara, who had been gathering fallen branches for kindling nearby, simply walked over and put her booted foot on the spool to hold it steady. He glanced at her, surprised, and then nodded. They worked that way for an hour. The next day, he handed her a pair of thick leather gloves. "The mare needs riding. She's been cooped up." Clara had ridden farm mules, but never a proper horse. "I don't know how," she said, her voice small. "You'll learn." He taught her. His methods were practical and stripped of all softness. He showed her how to saddle the mare, Bess, how to check the cinch, how to hold the reins without sawing at the horse's mouth. "She's got a gentle nature," he said, his hand on the mare's neck. "But don't fool her. She knows a weak hand." His own hands were never weak. They were scarred, calloused, and confident on the animal. Clara watched them, the way he calmed the horse with a single, firm stroke. They fell into a rhythm. They worked side by side for hours, often without speaking more than a dozen words. They mended fences, cleared brush, and patched the roof of the chicken coop. Clara's body ached. Her muscles, soft from a life of fear and indoor tasks, screamed in protest. But she did not complain. She hauled water. She stretched wire until her bandaged hand throbbed. She learned to swing a hammer. And slowly, something new grew in the silence between them. It was not friendship, and it was certainly not kindness. It was respect. He saw her work. He saw her rise every morning in the cold dark and face the day without complaint. She was not useless. She was steady. And she, in turn, saw him not just as a grieving, hollow-eyed ghost, but as a man of formidable strength. She saw the skill in his hands, the deep knowledge he had of the land, the way he cared for his animals before he cared for himself. He was a hard man, but he was an honest one. The world they inhabited was brutal, but he was not. One afternoon in late April, Jeremiah sent her to ride the fence line in the west pasture, checking for breaks. The sky was a pale, uncertain gray, but the air was mild. She enjoyed these small moments of solitude on the mare, the feeling of the horse's strength beneath her, the wide valley stretching out, greening at the edges. She was 2 miles from the cabin when the storm hit. It came out of the north without warning, a sudden, violent slash of wind that turned the sky from gray to a bruised, angry purple. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Then the rain came. Not a gentle spring shower, but a driving, horizontal assault of ice-cold water. It soaked her instantly. The blue shawl, heavy as it was, became a sodden weight. Her thin dress plastered itself to her skin. The mare whinnied, turning her back to the wind. Clara, blinded by the rain and her own hair whipped across her face, tried to turn the horse for home. The ride back was a nightmare. The ground turned to slick mud, and the mare stumbled, nearly unseating her. Clara's hands, gripping the reins, were numb. The cold was more than cold. It was a physical blow, stealing her breath. By the time she saw the cabin through the gray sheet of rain, She was trembling so violently she could barely stay in the saddle. She slid off the horse, her legs collapsing. She clung to the saddle horn, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. The cabin door flew open. Jeremiah was there. He had seen her coming. "Get inside!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. He didn't wait. He crossed the yard in 3 strides, grabbed the mare's reins with one hand, and seized Clara's arm with the other. He hauled her, half dragging, toward the porch. He shoved her through the door and into the warmth of the cabin. "Get those clothes off," he ordered. His voice was rough, edged with an urgency she had never heard. Clara tried. Her fingers were white, wooden. She fumbled with the buttons on her dress, but her hands would not obey. She was shaking too hard, her whole body convulsing with cold. "I can't," she whispered, her teeth clacking. He cursed, a low, sharp sound. "Turn around." She obeyed, her back to the fire. He was behind her, and she felt his hands at her neck, at the collar of her dress. They were not gentle, they were efficient, pulling the sodden material away from her skin. He worked the buttons down her back, his knuckles brushing her cold spine. Clara stood rigid, mortified, but too frozen to protest. He pulled the wet dress down her arms and let it fall in a puddle at her feet. She was left in her thin, cotton shift, which was just as wet, clinging to her ribs and legs, leaving nothing to the imagination. "The shawl, too," he commanded. She fumbled with the heavy, waterlogged wool and let it drop. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from his own bed in the corner. "Arms up!" He wrapped it around her, his movements swift and impersonal, enclosing her in a cocoon of dry, warm wool. He spun her around and pushed her down into the chair by the fire, shoving it so close her boots nearly touched the hearth. "Stay," he said. He went back outside into the storm. She heard him leading the mare to the barn. Clara sat, huddled in the blanket, the smell of him, smoke, leather, and something uniquely male, enveloping her. The fire began to sting her frozen skin. He came back in, slamming the door against the wind. He was soaked himself, water dripping from his hair and beard. He ignored his own state, grabbed the poker, and stoked the fire until it roared, sending a wave of intense heat toward her. He looked at her. Her hair was plastered to her skull, and her face was pale, her lips blue. She was still shaking, though less violently. Their eyes met. In that moment, the cabin shrank. There was only the sound of the rain lashing the windows and the crackle of the fire. She was half naked under his blanket. He was the man who owned her, the man who had undressed her. A deep, painful blush rose from her chest, warring with the cold. She saw something in his eyes, not desire, but an intense, focused awareness. He was seeing her, really seeing her, as a woman, not just a pair of hands. He was the first to look away. He broke the contact with a rough clearing of his throat. He grabbed a different blanket from the trunk, stripped off his own wet shirt by the door, and scrubbed his hair and beard dry. He did not go to his bed. Instead, he took the blanket and lay down on the floor near the hearth, between her and the main part of the room. A silent, self-imposed barrier. A guard. That night, Clara did not go to the loft. She stayed in the chair, wrapped in his blanket. Long after the storm passed and the cabin grew quiet, she stared into the flames. She was no longer cold. A strange, unfamiliar heat pooled deep in her belly. She could still feel the imprint of his calloused fingers on her back, a touch that had been born of necessity but had left a brand. She remembered the heat in his gray eyes, and she was afraid. Not of him, but of the feeling he had awakened in her. A week later, a calf was born with a lame leg. Its mother a first-time heifer who rejected it, kicking it away. Jeremiah went out to the pasture and came back with a grim look. "It won't make the night. I'll put it out of its misery." "No," Clara said. He stopped, surprised by her tone. "It's starving, and it's weak. It's the way of things." No, she repeated, her voice stronger. She marched past him, out into the field where the small creature lay shivering in the new grass. She picked it up. It was light, its bones sharp beneath the thin hide. She carried it back to the cabin. Jeremiah watched her, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. "You're wasting your time. Clara, it won't drink." "It will," she said. She laid the calf on a pile of old sacks near the fire. She warmed a cup of milk, dipped a clean rag in it, and patiently, stubbornly, held it to the calf's mouth, squeezing drops onto its tongue. She stayed there all night. Jeremiah went to his bed, but she heard him turn, restless, the ropes of his bed creaking. The cabin was lit only by the low glow of the fire. Clara sat on the floor, whispering to the animal, rubbing its thin legs, forcing it to swallow, drop by drop. She did not think about why she was doing it. She only knew that she could not stand by and watch something be discarded simply because it was weak, because it was not perfect. Sometime before dawn, she fell asleep, her head resting against the rough log wall, her hand lying on the calf's bony flank. Jeremiah woke first. He saw her in the gray light. She was slumped in sleep, her hair loose from its bun, falling in a tangled, dark wave over her shoulder. Her face, so often tense with fear or concentration, was soft. Her lips were slightly parted, her breath slow and even. Her hand rested on the calf, which was breathing steadily, its head up. He stood by his bed and just watched her. He watched her for a long, silent time. The woman his neighbors called Barren goods. The woman who had fought the cold, the work, and his own silence. Who had stayed up all night to save a crippled calf he had already dismissed as a loss. He saw the strength in her, a quiet, fierce endurance that matched the mountains themselves. He saw the gentleness in her sleeping face. He saw the blue shawl of his dead wife draped over the back of the chair. A muscle in his jaw clenched. Something hard and frozen deep inside him. A place he had not touched since Mary and Eliza had died. Shifted. It cracked. Painfully. They needed supplies. The spring work required staples they did not have. The trip to the small settlement, 10 miles down the valley, was unavoidable. It was the first time they had gone to town together. Clara dreaded it. She wore her best dress, the one she had arrived in, and Mary's shawl. She felt like a fraud. She knew what they would see, the broken widower and the barren girl he had bought. The town was little more than a dirt street, a mercantile, a smithy, and a saloon, but the eyes were immediate. As Jeremiah tied the wagon, Clara felt the whispers start. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the boardwalk planks. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, cured leather, and gossip. Mrs. Gable was there, and she gave Clara a curt, supportive nod. But 3 other women, wives of local ranchers, were gathered by the bolt cloth. They stopped talking when Clara entered, their eyes raking over her. Clara moved to the back, picking up flour and salt, trying to make herself invisible. Jeremiah was at the counter, speaking in low tones to the proprietor. The whispers started again, sharp and clear in the small space. "That's her, the one he took in. Land sakes, she's plain as mud. And barren, too. My husband told me. Sold her for debt. They call her a mule. Martha, a mule who'll never foal. Can't imagine what he wants with her. Lesson it's just to have a woman's shadow in the house." Clara froze, her hand on a tin of baking soda. The word mule struck her like a physical blow. She felt the blood rush to her face, a hot, agonizing burn of shame. She wanted to run, to disappear. "Poor Jeremiah," the first woman said, her voice dripping with false pity. "So lonely he'd take in a mule. It's pitiful." Before Clara could move, Jeremiah was there. He had not been at the counter. He had been standing just behind her. He moved into the aisle, his tall frame blocking the women. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. His words were low, cold, and lethal. "Shut your mouths," the women gasped. One of them, Martha, tried to look indignant. "Mr. McAllister, we were just—" "I heard what you were—" He cut her off, his gray eyes flat as ice. He took a step closer. "You ever speak of her again, you'll answer to me. You understand me, Martha?" The woman turned pale and nodded, unable to speak. Jeremiah turned to Clara. His face was a thundercloud. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh, not gently. "We're leaving." He all but dragged her from the store, leaving their supplies on the counter. He threw her up onto the wagon seat, untied the reins, and cracked the whip. They rode out of town at a pace that rattled her teeth, leaving a cloud of dust and stunned silence behind them. The 10 miles back to the ranch were the longest of Clara's life. The silence in the wagon was a ringing, terrible thing. Jeremiah stared straight ahead, his jaw set so hard she was afraid his teeth would break. Clara's humiliation had soured into terror. He was angry. He was angry that she had brought this shame on him, that she had made him a subject of pity and gossip. He was going to send her back, or worse. He pulled the wagon into the yard, jumped down, and stalked into the cabin. Clara scrambled after him, her heart hammering. He slammed the door. The cabin was dark. He paced, his boots heavy on the floorboards. A caged animal. He went to the shelf, grabbed the whiskey bottle and a tin cup. He poured it full, his hands shaking. Clara stood by the door, trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for them to—" He spun on her. "Sorry for what? For them being harpies?" He downed the whiskey in one gulp and slammed the cup down. He stared at her, his chest heaving. The hollow look was gone, replaced by a raw, active pain. He grabbed a second cup, poured it, and shoved it into her hand. "Drink." She just stared at it, confused. "I said drink." She lifted the cup, her hand shaking, and took a sip. The raw spirit burned her throat, making her cough. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. He paced to the fire and back. He stopped, inches from her, looming over her. She flinched, expecting a blow. He didn't move. He just looked at her, his eyes searching her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was broken, the gravel worn smooth by grief. "I didn't take you here to bear me anything." The words hung in the air. Clara looked up, her eyes wide, tears welling. She didn't understand. They think I wanted an heir, that I wanted—" He shook his head, unable to say the words. He looked away from her, at the empty chair where Mary used to sit. "I just didn't want to be alone anymore." The confession was so quiet, so raw. It broke the last of her control. The humiliation in the store, the terror of the ride home, and now this admission of a loneliness that so perfectly mirrored her own. It was too much. A sob, a raw, ugly sound she had held back for a lifetime, tore from her throat. The tin cup fell from her hand, splashing whiskey on the floor. She covered her face, her shoulders heaving. She had not cried like this when her family sold her. She had not cried like this on the journey. This was the sound of a heart breaking open. She stumbled, her legs giving way, and fell against him. Clara cried into the rough wool of his shirt. She clutched his arms, her body shaking apart, weeping for her barrenness, for her shame, for the cousin who had broken her, for the family that had discarded her, and for this man's impossible, unexpected defense. Jeremiah stood rigid. He was a stone wall. He did not move. He did not put his arms around her. He did not comfort her. His hands, those capable, scarred hands, remained frozen at his sides. He was just as lost as she was, trapped, his body tense as a bowstring, letting her storm of grief break over him. A silent, unmoving witness. The valley bled green. The last of the snow receded into the high shaded crevices of the bitter roots, and the land, saturated by the melt, exploded with life. Wild ryegrass grew thick in the pastures, and the air, which for so long had smelled only of ice and pine, was now heavy with the scent of sweet clover, damp earth, and the sun heating the rocks. Summer arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a conqueror, driving out the memory of the cold with a fierce, dry heat. The days grew long, the sun a relentless white eye in a vast blue sky. The nights were short, barely cooling the land before dawn broke again, painting the peaks in shades of apricot and rose. With the warmth came a new kind of tension. In the winter, the cold had been a barrier, a third presence in the cabin that kept them separate, huddled in their own private miseries. Now, there was nothing between them but the warm, thin air. Clara's awareness of Jeremiah McAllister shifted. He was no longer just a silent, grieving shape. He was a physical presence. She was aware of the breadth of his shoulders as he mended a harness, the sun catching the dark hairs on his forearms, slick with sweat. She was aware of the way his shirt pulled tight across his back when he lifted a heavy feed sack. He moved with a contained, coiled strength, and the silence that had once seemed hollow now felt charged, as if it held back 1,000 unsaid things. Their partnership, born of necessity and forged in the spring rains, settled into a smooth, functional rhythm. They were a machine of 2 parts, moving around the ranch with an economy of words that bordered on its own language. He would gesture with his chin toward a broken fence post, and she would fetch the wire stretcher and the hammer. She would leave a fresh bucket of water by the corral, and he would nod, a curt acknowledgement as he led the horses to drink. He trusted her with more. The calf she had saved, which she had named Stubbs, followed her everywhere, a clumsy, devoted shadow. Jeremiah watched her with the animal, a flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, in his eyes. One hot afternoon, he came out of the cabin carrying his rifle. "Come on," he said. She followed him to a clearing behind the barn, where he had set up 3 empty tins on a log. "You live here. You learn to use this," he said, handing her the weapon. It was a Winchester, heavy and smelling of oil and gunpowder. Its weight was unfamiliar, dangerous. "I've never shot a gun," she said, her voice small. "I know. That's why I'm teaching you." He stood behind her. His proximity was immediate, overwhelming. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, though he was not touching her. "Hold it steady. Stock against your shoulder. Tight." She tried, but the rifle was awkward, her arms trembling. "Not like that. You'll break your own collarbone." He stepped closer. His hand closed over her shoulder, his thumb pressing into the hollow, positioning the rifle butt. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt clean through her. He reached around her, his other hand covering hers on the forestock, guiding her grip. She was encased by him. His chin was just above her head. She could feel his breath stir her hair as he spoke, his voice a low rumble against her back. "Line up the sight. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Slow." She held her breath. The world narrowed to the bead of the front sight and the distant, shimmering tin. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening, the kick of the rifle slamming into her shoulder, throwing her back against his chest. She stumbled, and his arms came around her, steadying her. "You flinched," he said, his voice still rumbling against her ear. He did not let go, not right away. He held her there for a second too long, his arms a hard circle around her. "I know," she whispered, her heart hammering for a reason that had nothing to do with the gunshot. He stepped back, breaking the contact so abruptly she almost fell forward. "Again!" They stayed there for an hour. She learned to brace herself, to breathe, to aim. She even managed to hit one of the tins, the sound of the bullet striking metal a sharp, satisfying ping. "Good," he grunted, taking the rifle back. "You'll do." That evening, She found him on the porch. The sun was bleeding into the mountains, and the heat of the day was just beginning to break. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, the cherry glowing in the dusk. He had been smoking more lately, a habit that seemed to fill the quiet moments, surrounding him in a thin, acrid cloud. She had come out to throw wash water into the yard, and she stopped. She had never questioned him. She had never spoken out of turn, but she had watched him cough in the mornings, a dry, harsh sound. "You shouldn't do that," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He went still. He slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes, in the fading light, were shadowed and hard to read. He took a long drag from the cigarette, held it, and blew the smoke out in a slow plume. "That's so." It was not a question. "It's a filthy habit," she said, her boldness surprising even herself. "It makes you cough." He looked at the cigarette in his hand, then back at her. A long, tense silence stretched between them. She thought he would yell at her, tell her to mind her place, remind her that she was nothing. A slow smile cracked the hard line of his mouth. It was not a real smile, just a pulling at the corners, but it was the most expression she had ever seen on his face. "Well, I'll be—" He looked at the cigarette again and, to her utter shock, dropped it onto the dirt and crushed it out with his boot. "Don't need you nagging me like a wife, Clara," he said, but the words had no bite. "I wasn't nagging," she replied, her face warming. "I was just saying—" He grunted and looked back at the mountains. "Well, you said it." The small victory felt larger than hitting the tin. Later that night, she heard him by the woodpile, a hacking cough that proved her point. She lay in her pallet, and for the first time, she smiled in the dark. A few days later, they were working to rehang the heavy barn door, which had slipped one of its leather hinges. It was hot, strenuous work. He was lifting, she was guiding. The door slipped, catching his hand against the frame. "Damn it all," he roared, jerking his hand back. He had not truly hurt himself, just a scrape. But the frustration of the day's heat and the stubborn work boiled over. Clara, struggling with her own end of the door, was overtired. "Well, cursing at it won't fix the hinge. Mr. McAllister." He froze, staring at her, his eyes blazing. She braced herself. And then he laughed. It was a shocking sound. It was not a smile, not a grunt. It was a real laugh, a short, rusty bark that seemed to be pulled from him against his will. It was the first time she had ever heard it. The sound startled her so much. She laughed too, a quick, nervous giggle. The tension of the moment, of the entire summer, broke. They stood there for a second. Two dusty, sweat-streaked people, a massive, broken door between them. And they were, for a moment, just a man and a woman sharing a small, ridiculous piece of work. The laughter faded. He cleared his throat, his face settling back into its familiar, hard lines. But something was different. The air was lighter. "Let's try it again," he said. The summer nights were the hardest. The heat clung to the cabin, and the loft was stifling. The straw pallet seemed to radiate the day's warmth, and sleep was a long time coming. One night, the air was so thick and still, Clara felt she was suffocating. The moon was high, bathing the yard in a bright, silver light, but it offered no relief. After an hour of tossing, she climbed down the ladder. Jeremiah was asleep in his bed, a still shape under a single sheet. She moved silently, her bare feet padding on the cool floorboards. She needed air. She slipped outside. The world was quiet, the mountains stark silhouettes against the starry sky. She wore only her nightdress, a simple, worn cotton shift that ended at her shins. It was thin, and the faint breeze that drifted down from the peaks was a blessing against her skin. She walked toward the barn, seeking the deeper shadows. The air inside would be cooler, and it smelled of hay and dust, a comforting, earthy scent. The big door was open a few feet to let the air circulate. She slipped inside, into the deep, welcoming dark, and then she saw it. A single point of light in the back, near the stalls. A lantern, burning low. Jeremiah was there. He was sitting on a hay bale, his back against a post. He was not drinking. He was just sitting, his hat off, his head bowed. He often came here. She knew, when the cabin, when his bed, held too many ghosts. She must have made a sound, a shifting of her foot, a small intake of breath. He looked up. His head lifted, and his eyes found her. She was caught, halfway between the door and the shadows, bathed in the silver moonlight streaming in from outside and the warm, golden glow of his lantern. The thin cotton of her nightdress, meant for the privacy of her loft, was rendered nearly transparent by the conflicting light. It clung to her, hinting at the shape of her legs, the curve of her hip, the small, high line of her breasts. Her hair was down, unbound, falling over her shoulders. Jeremiah did not move. He did not speak. He just looked. His gaze was not the hollow stare she had first known. It was not the cold, assessing look of the rancher. It was something else. It was raw, and it was hungry. It was the look of a man who had been alone for a very long time, a man starved for softness, who was suddenly seeing it standing before him. He stared at her as if she were water and he was dying of thirst. He didn't blink. He couldn't look away. Clara's heart stopped. She knew she should cover herself, run, retreat to the cabin. But she was pinned by his gaze. The air in the barn, which she had sought for its coolness, was suddenly electric, hotter than the loft. A deep, heavy pulse began to beat low in her body. She saw the slow clench of his jaw, the tightening of his hand on his knee. A silent, agonizing moment of raw desire passed between them. It was a question asked and answered in a single, shared breath. He broke it. He made a sound, a low groan, as if in pain. He surged to his feet, kicking the hay bale over. The motion was so violent, she flinched, a small, involuntary step back. The flinch broke the spell. His face shuddered, the desire replaced by a look of sharp self-loathing. He turned his back on her. "Go back to the house, Clara," he said. His voice was a harsh rasp, choked. "Get out of here." She didn't wait. She turned and fled, her bare feet flying over the cool dirt of the yard. She scrambled up the ladder to her loft, her hands shaking so badly she almost slipped. She dove into her pallet, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, her heart choking her. She heard him come in minutes later. He did not light a lamp. She heard the clink of the whiskey bottle, the gurgle of a long drink, and then the sound of him sitting heavily at the table, not going to his bed. He sat there, in the dark, for the rest of the night. Clara lay awake, her skin on fire. She was terrified, but not of him. She was terrified of the look in his eyes, and more, of the way her own body had answered it. She began to understand. She was falling for him. It was not a soft, girlish feeling. It was a hard, painful realization, like a bone setting wrong. It was not just gratitude for his defense of her in the store. It was not just the comfort of their working partnership. It was something deeper, something that had taken root in the shared silence, in the moments of unexpected laughter, in the way he had taught her to shoot. Her family had seen her as useless. Her cousin had seen her as an object to be taken. The women in town saw her as a mule. Jeremiah McAllister saw her. He saw her hands, blistered and strong. He saw her patience with a crippled calf. He saw her anger at his smoking. And he had, however briefly, listened. He had treated her not as damaged, not as barren, but as capable. He had stood between her and the world's judgment. And tonight, in the barn, he had looked at her. He had looked at her as a woman. He had wanted her. He had also let her go. He had pushed her away, not pulled her in. He had protected her. even from himself. This knowledge settled in her, a heavy, warm stone in her chest. She was in love with this broken, silent, grieving man, and she knew, with a certainty that ached, that it was a love that could have no future. He was still married to a ghost. She was the Barren girl. There was no place in the world for them. The confessions came 2 nights later. The tension between them since the barn was a tight, brittle thing. They barely spoke, avoiding each other's eyes. The easy partnership was gone, replaced by a hyper-aware, awkward silence. It was another hot night. He was on the porch, and he had been drinking. She could tell by the rigid set of his shoulders. She came out to sit on the top step, not near him, just needing to be out of the stifling cabin. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the stars prick the deep velvet of the sky. She loved the stars, he said, his voice quiet. Clara knew who he meant. Mary? He nodded, his gaze fixed on the heavens. She was from back east, used to the city. She hated how dark it was here, scared her, until I told her to look up. She said she never knew there were so many. We used to sit out here. Clara said nothing, just listened. He had never spoken her name. She was a good woman, he said, his voice thick. She deserved better than me, better than this place. You loved her very much, Clara whispered. I did, he said. He took a drink from the cup in his hand. But it was Eliza. It was the baby. That's what broke it all. He went quiet again, and Clara thought he was finished. But then he spoke, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. She was so small. The fever took her fast, faster than Mary. She was burning up. I held her all night. I kept putting cool cloths on her, but it didn't do nothing. She just burned. He stopped. His hand tightened on the tin cup, his knuckles white. And then she stopped breathing, right in my arms. She was so light. 1 second, she was my daughter, and the next, she was just gone. Just a little light thing. I held her till the sun came up. I couldn't put her down. Clara's hand flew to her own mouth, stifling a sob. The image of this big, hard man holding his dead child shattered her. She slid closer, unthinking, her shoulder almost touching his arm. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a pain so profound it was almost black. Folks say, you should have more, have another, as if you can just replace one, as if she wasn't Eliza. I know, Clara whispered, tears streaming down her own face. He looked at her, his gaze sharp. How could you know? The question hung in the hot, still air. She could lie. She could say nothing. But he had given her his deepest wound. She owed him hers. They call me Barren, she said, her voice shaking. My family, the women in town, you heard them. A mule. It's just talk, he said gruffly. No, she said. It's not just talk. I can't have children. He was silent. He had taken her on those terms, but to hear it spoken aloud, by her, was different. I wasn't born this way. She forced the words out. Her body was trembling. This was the secret she had carried, the core of her shame. Back home, I had a cousin. He wouldn't leave me be. One night, he tried in the kitchen. I fought him. I fought hard. I pushed him away, and he got angry. She was crying freely now, the words tasting like ash. He shoved me, hard, backwards. There were stairs, down to the cellar. I fell, all the way down. I landed wrong. Jeremiah's hand shot out and gripped her shoulder. His fingers bit into her flesh, not in anger, but in a terrible, vice-like grip. He ran, she sobbed, He ran. I lay there for a long time. It was dark, and the bleeding started. I didn't know at first. I didn't know I was with child. His child. The admission was a rip in her soul. I lost it, down there, in the dark, on the dirt floor. And it did damage. The bleeding wouldn't stop for weeks. My mother, she called in an old woman, not a doctor. She said I was ruined inside, that the fall, the loss, it had broken what made me a woman. No doctor would see me. They just started calling me Barren. It was my punishment. My mother said, for fighting, for... She couldn't finish. She bent over, her body racked with sobs. The full, complete shame of her past finally spoken aloud in the night. Jeremiah's grip on her shoulder changed. It did not lessen. It simply altered. He pulled her. He pulled her against his side, and his other arm came around her, pulling her tight against his chest. He held her, his hand tangling in her hair, pressing her face into his shirt. He held her as she wept. He held her with the same desperation with which he had held his dying daughter. He rocked her, a small, stiff movement, as if he had forgotten how. He said nothing. He just let her grief pour into him, absorbing it, his own body rigid with a new, cold fury she had never felt. He held her, and he stroked her hair, his rough hand surprisingly gentle. Their shared grief was a living thing in the night. It was no longer two separate, lonely pains. It had become a tether, binding them. Two broken, scarred people, in the middle of a vast, indifferent wilderness. He held her until she was cried out, until she was just a spent, trembling weight against him. He did not let her go. That night, she could not go back to the loft. The thought of being alone up there, after tearing her soul open, was unbearable. He must have known. He led her inside, sat her at the table, and poured her a small measure of whiskey. "Drink it," he said. His voice was thick. She did. It burned, but it steadied her. He did not go to his bed. He blew out the lamp. The only light was the silver moonlight through the open door. He looked at her, his face a mask of shadows. Then he turned and climbed the ladder to the loft. She waited. She heard him moving. He came back down with her pallet and her blanket. He unrolled the straw ticking on the floor, near the hearth where he had slept during the storm. "You sleep here," he said. "Where will you?" "I'll take the loft," he said. It's hotter, but you should be down here." She lay down on the pallet, her body aching with exhaustion. She watched him. He stood by the ladder, a tall, dark shadow. He was going to leave her, but he didn't. He walked over to her. He stood looking down at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he knelt beside the pallet. He did not touch her body. He reached out, and his hand, calloused and scarred, met hers. He laced his fingers through hers, a simple, solid grip. Clara's breath caught. It was more intimate than a kiss. He just knelt there, holding her hand, his thumb rubbing slow circles on her knuckles. The air from the barn, from their confession, from their shared losses, returned. It was thick with heat, with breath, with the aching, desperate need of two people who had been alone for too long. She turned her hand, her fingers gripping his. She looked at him in the moonlight. She saw the pain in his eyes, but she also saw the desire from the barn, and it was no longer warring with guilt. It was mixed with a tenderness, a fierce protection that stunned her. He leaned down, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. His mouth met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was aching. It was rough with whiskey and salt from her tears. It was the kiss of a starving man. He kissed her with a desperate, pent-up hunger, and she, God help her, kissed him back. She clung to his hand, her other hand coming up to fist in his shirt. She was just as starved as he was. His mouth was hot, demanding, and she opened to him, a small, broken sound in her throat. He groaned, the sound vibrating through her. His other hand came up, cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing the tears from her cheek. He deepened the kiss, his tongue exploring her, a raw, desperate claiming. It was everything. It was all the words they had not said. It was the comfort she had craved, the desire she had feared, the acceptance she had never known. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his forehead resting against hers. They were both shaking. He looked into her eyes, his own blazing in the dark. He wanted her. She could see it. He could take her, right here, on the floor of his cabin. And she would let him. She would thank him. But he didn't. He pulled his mouth away. Though he did not release her, he kissed her forehead. A brief, hard press of his lips. He looked at her, his eyes holding hers, and his voice was a raw whisper, scraping from his soul. "I want you, Clara," he said. "All of you. The work, the silence, the everything. All of you." He took a ragged breath, his hand tightening on hers. "But not like this. Not because I'm strong and you're grateful. Not because of what he did." He stopped, his voice choked with rage at the thought of her cousin. He composed himself. "When you're ready. When you're sure. When it's you choosing." He released her hand, stood up, and before she could say a word, he turned and climbed the ladder into the darkness of the loft, leaving her alone on the floor, her lips burning, her body aching, and her heart, which she had thought was broken and barren, suddenly, painfully, shockingly full. The loft was a compromise. After that night, after their shared confessions had stripped them bare, Jeremiah had climbed the ladder, and Clara had stayed below. But the arrangement felt different. He was no longer banishing himself to the place of his grief. He was giving her the heart of his home, the place by the fire. And she, lying on her pallet, was no longer a servant banished to the cold. She was being protected. They lived in this new, fragile space for weeks. The kiss they had shared was a ghost that lived between them, a silent, third presence in the room. They were painfully, exquisitely aware of each other. A brush of hands as he passed her the coffee pot was enough to send a jolt through her. When he spoke, his voice, low and rough, seemed to touch her skin. They worked side by side in the high summer heat, mending the corral, their shoulders almost touching. The air between them was thick with things unsaid, with the memory of that desperate, aching kiss. Jeremiah, for his part, was a man holding a line. He treated her with a new, gruff tenderness. He was no longer just a silent partner. He would ask, "Did you eat?" He would, on a particularly hot afternoon, draw a bucket of cool water from the well and hand it to her first. A gesture so simple, so profound, it made her heart ache. He was, she realized, honoring his word. He was waiting for her. He was giving her the time to be sure. But the valley was not the world, and the world was about to intrude. The sound of a wagon in the yard was what broke the late August stillness. It was Mrs. Gable. She pulled her mare to a halt, her face grim, which was a shade darker than her usual pragmatic severity. "Afternoon, Jeremiah, Miss Clara," she said, climbing down with a grunt. "Brought you that sack of oats you asked for, and some news." Clara came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Jeremiah walked over from the barn, his expression guarded. "What news, Mrs. Gable?" he asked. "Word from down south. From your people," she said, her sharp eyes on Clara. "Seems your father has had a change of heart about you." Clara's blood ran cold. "Ma'am? Don't look so surprised. Girl, it ain't your winning personality he's after. Mrs. Gable pulled a smaller sack from her wagon. There's a land dispute down your way. Something about the railroad coming through and a deed line being drawn wrong 50 years ago. Turns out that patch of worthless scrub your family lives on is suddenly sitting next to a very valuable piece of potential. Jeremiah's face darkened. Get to the point, Martha. The point is, she said, your father is making noise. He's been in town, at the lawyer's office. He's saying he's been swindled, saying he's a grieving father who, in his desperation, made a bad bargain. He wants to reclaim his property. Clara felt the porch board sway beneath her. Property. That's the word he's using. Mrs. Gable said, her voice softer now, her gaze full of pity. He says he wants his daughter back. Folks are saying he thinks he can use you as leverage in this land deal. Or maybe he thinks your contract with Mr. McAllister here is a weakness that can be exploited. She looked at Jeremiah. He's making it sound like you took advantage of him. Jeremiah, and that you took damaged goods. The old name, damaged, Barren, mule, it all came crashing back. The fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered like thin ice. He can't, Jeremiah said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The debt is paid. The receipt is filed. A receipt ain't a bill of sale for a human being, not one a judge is like to look kindly on, not if the family protests. Mrs. Gable warned. He's stirring up mud, Jeremiah, and you and this girl are standing right in the middle of it. You be careful. That's all I'll say. She left the oats, refused a cup of water, and rode away. A harbinger of a storm she had only just glimpsed. Clara stood on the porch, frozen. She could not move. She could not breathe. Jeremiah stood in the yard, his back to her, staring at the dust cloud her wagon had left. He can't, he said again, to himself. Clara turned and fled into the cabin. The official letter arrived 3 days later. A rider from the settlement paid $1 to make the trip, handed it to Jeremiah. Clara watched from the doorway as he broke the wax seal. She watched his face. It was the face she had seen that first day, hollow, hard, and cold. He read the paper, and the muscle in his jaw clenched so tight she thought it would break the bone. He read it twice. "What is it?" she whispered, though she already knew. He folded the letter, his movements precise, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "It's nothing, just business." "Jeremiah," she said, her voice shaking. "Tell me." "I said it's nothing." He turned to walk to the barn. "You're lying," she cried, the accusation ripping out of her. "It's him, isn't it? It's my father." He stopped. He slowly turned. "Go inside. Clara, make supper." "No, I won't be treated like a child. I won't be handled. I have a right to know. He's coming for me, isn't he?" Jeremiah walked back to her, his shadow falling over her on the porch. He looked tired, defeated. He pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. It was from a lawyer. It was full of words she barely understood. Nullification of contract, restitution, dispute of deed, and then the words that mattered, false representation. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a new, sickening dread. What does that mean, false representation?" Jeremiah's gaze was hard. "He's claiming the terms of the agreement, that the debt was paid in exchange for your service, is void, because, he says, you were presented as a whole woman, fit for duties, and that you are not." The breath left her in a rush. "Because I'm Barren." It was not a question. He said nothing. He just watched her. "He's saying I'm faulty goods," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. "And he's nullifying the sale. He's coming to take me back. Clara, and you'll let him." she stated. The realization was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. Of course he would. Why wouldn't he? She was a legal problem. She was a source of shame. She was a woman who could not give him the one thing a man truly wanted, the one thing he had lost. She was a mule. "You stop that," he said, his voice low. "It's true," she accused, backing away from him, back into the cabin. "It's all true, Mrs. Gable said it. You're just lonely, but you're not lonely enough to fight for me, not for damaged goods. I'm a burden. I'm bringing this trouble to your door. You defended me in town because of your pride, because I was yours. But now I'm just trouble, and you regret it. You regret all of it." "Clara, that's not—" "Don't," she sobbed, holding up a hand. Don't lie. Not now. I understand. It's all right." She turned and ran to the ladder, scrambling up to the loft, to the one place that was still hers. She heard him curse, a low, vicious sound. She heard him slam his fist against the doorframe. She heard his heavy boots stomp off the porch and fade toward the creek. She lay on her pallet in the stifling heat of the late afternoon, and she made her plan. She had always been a runner. She had run from her cousin. She had been sent away by her family. She had run from the whispers in town, hiding in this valley. Now, she would run again. She would not be here when her father came. She would not be the rope in a tug of war between two men who both saw her as a thing. And she would not. She would not. Stay and watch Jeremiah's defense of her curdle into resentment. She would not stay to see the day he looked at her and wished she were whole. She would not stay to see the pity in his eyes. She would leave, tonight, when he was asleep. She would take the mare, Bess. She owed him for the horse, but she would pay him back, someday. She would ride east, not back home, just away. She would disappear. It was the only thing she was good at. The hours passed. She heard him come back, long after dark. He did not light the lamp. He sat at the table, and the cabin was filled with the familiar, acrid smell of whiskey. He was drinking. He was drinking like he had that first week, with a grim, silent determination. He was drinking away the trouble she had brought him. The thought solidified her resolve. She waited. She waited until the moon was high and his chair was quiet. She waited until she heard the sound of him, not going to his bed, but slumping onto her old pallet by the hearth, and his breathing sinking into a heavy, drunken sleep. She rose, a shadow in the moonlight. She did not take her pallet. She took nothing of his. She found her old satchel, the one she had arrived with. She put in the worn Bible. She found a heel of bread and a dried piece of beef from the pantry. She filled a water skin. She looked at the blue shawl, Mary's shawl, hanging on a peg. It was the one thing that had felt like kindness. She left it. She crept down the ladder, her bare feet silent on the wood. He was there, by the fire, a dark shape, his face to the wall. He was asleep. She slipped out the door, into the bright, cold moonlight. The yard was silver. The barn was a block of shadow. She moved quickly, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She was almost there. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice was not from the cabin. It was from the barn door. He was there, leaning against the frame, silhouetted against the dark, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not drunk. He had not been asleep. He had been waiting. She froze. I was checking on Bess." "In the middle of the night? With your traveling bag?" His voice was deathly quiet, colder than any winter wind. It was laced with a deep, vibrating anger that terrified her. She tried to run past him, into the night, but he moved, blocking her path. "Let me go, Jeremiah." "No. You can't keep me here. I'm not your property. You said, or maybe I am, and my father is coming. Let him find an empty cabin. It's better for you. Better for me, he laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. You think you know what's better for me? You think you can just run like I'm your father? Like I'm that bastard who hurt you? Let me go, she cried, pushing at his chest. It was like pushing against a stone wall. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her. Why? Why are you running? Clara, tell me. Her fear finally broke, and all the pain, all the shame of the day, of her entire life, poured out. Because I am not enough, she screamed, the sound echoing in the silent yard. I will never be enough. You heard the letter. I'm false representation. I'm a mule who'll never foal. I'm a broken thing. You stop that, he growled, shaking her. It's true, she sobbed, hitting his chest now, her blows weak. You want a wife. You want what you lost. And I can't give you that. I can't give you children. I can't give you anything but trouble and shame and whispers in town. You deserve more. You deserve whole. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip so tight it hurt, and he shook her once, hard. You fool, he whispered, his voice cracking. You absolute fool. He pulled her against him, his arms crushing her, his face buried in her hair. You think I've been afraid of your father? He whispered, his voice thick. You think I give a damn about some lawyer or some piece of paper? He held her out, his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His eyes, in the moonlight, were not hollow. They were blazing, they were raw, and they were full of a terrible, aching fear. I've been afraid of this, he said, his voice ragged. Of feeling again. I've been afraid of you. Clara stared at him, her sobs catching in her throat. When Mary and Eliza died, I died, he said, his voice breaking. I was a ghost. I was just waiting, drinking myself into the grave, waiting for it to be over. This place, it was a tomb, and I was fine with that. He pulled her closer. And then you came, this quiet, terrified thing in a thin shawl, and I watched you. I watched you fight the cold. I watched you work until your hands bled, and you never complained. You saved that damn calf. You stood up to me about smoking. You're not a shadow. Clara, you're the only damn thing in this valley that's real. You're the only thing that's alive. You brought this place back. You brought me back. He choked on the words, his composure shattering. And it scares the hell out of me. I'm afraid. I'm afraid of loving you. Because I do. God help me. I love you. I'm afraid of needing you. Because I do. And I am. I am terrified of losing you. Like I lost them. That's what I'm afraid of. Not your father. Not some rumor in town. I'm afraid of you leaving. Clara was weeping, her body trembling, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. But, Jeremiah, she whispered, I can't. I told you, I can't. What? He demanded, his voice soft, desperate. What can't you do? I can't give you children, she sobbed, the words her final, deepest shame. I can't replace Eliza. I can't. I'm Barren. He put his hand on her cheek, his rough, calloused thumb wiping away her tears. His eyes were fierce, his soul visible in them. I don't need children, he said, his voice a broken whisper. He pulled her forehead to his, their breath mingling. I need you. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of the loft. It was a vow. It was a promise. It was the kiss of a man who had found the one thing he could not live without. It was tender, and it was deep, and it was a claiming. He kissed her as if she were not broken, but precious, as if she were not barren, but the only source of life he had. He lifted her. She was light, a feather in his arms. He carried her from the barn, across the silver yard, and into the cabin. He did not take her to the pallet on the floor. He walked to the corner. He walked to his bed. The bed he had not shared. The bed that had been a monument to his grief. He set her down gently on the quilt, his eyes never leaving hers, asking the final, silent question. Clara looked up at him, at this strong, broken, beautiful man who had just offered her his entire, tattered soul. She reached up, her hand trembling, and touched his face. "I'm not running," she whispered. "I choose you." He took a ragged breath. He unlaced her boots and pulled them off. He unbuttoned her dress. His hands, which she had only ever seen handle ropes and rifles, shaking. He pushed the rough cloth from her shoulders. He kissed the place where her collarbone met her throat. He was slow, reverent. He pulled the thin shift over her head, and she was bare before him. He just looked at her, his eyes full of a wonder that made her want to weep. He saw no flaws. He saw no damage. He just saw her. He stripped off his own shirt, his own trousers, his eyes never leaving hers. She saw the long, puckered scar on his ribs, a history she did not know, and it did not matter. He came to her on the bed, pulling the quilt over them. The air was cool, but she was burning. He lay beside her, propped on one elbow, just looking at her. "You're sure?" he whispered. It was not a question of her desire. It was a question of her heart. "I am sure," she said. Their joining was not a fire. It was a slow, deep warmth. It was tender. It was trembling. It was desperate. It was the fumbling, awkward, and profoundly honest coming together of two people who had thought their lives were already over. He moved inside her with a care that stunned her. His eyes locked on hers, as if he were memorizing her. For him, it was the release of 2 years of frozen grief, a return to the living. For Clara, it was the first time she had ever been touched with anything but violence or cold indifference. The first time she had ever been wanted. The first time she had ever felt truly, completely safe. She clung to him, tears streaming from her eyes, her body arching to meet his, not in passion, but in a desperate, overwhelming need to be one, to be held, to be his. Afterward, long afterward, she lay curled against his side, his arm a heavy, possessive weight around her waist, her head on his chest, and she wept. She wept silently, her shoulders shaking, the tears soaking his skin. He held her, his hand stroking her hair. "What is it?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep and concern. Did I hurt you?" "No," she sobbed, clutching his hand. "No, I never knew." "Knew what, Clara?" "I never knew it could be like this, that anyone would." She could not finish. He understood. He kissed the top of her head, his grip tightening. "That you could be loved?" he finished for her, his voice rough. "Get used to it." He held her as she cried, held her as the last of her fear and shame washed away. And she slept, for the first time in her life. Not as a burden, not as a barren thing, but as a woman who was, in every way that mattered, whole. She woke to the sun streaming in the window, warm on her face. She was in his bed. He was beside her, awake, propped on his elbow, just watching her. His face, in the morning light, was unguarded, his eyes soft. He smiled, a real, slow smile. "Morning." "Morning," she whispered. And then the world rushed back. The letter, her father. "Jeremiah, the letter." "I know," he said. He sat up, his body strong and bare in the light. He pulled on his trousers and walked to the table. The letter was still there, a white scar on the dark wood. He picked it up. He walked to the hearth, where the embers of last night's fire still glowed. He took a piece of kindling, lit it, and then turned to her. "Come here." She wrapped the sheet around herself, her feet bare on the floor, and walked to him. He handed her the burning stick. "It's a lie," he said, "all of it." She looked at him, confused. The part about you being a burden, the part about you being faulty, the part about you being his property to take. He held the letter out, his other hand covering hers, steadying it. "Burn it." Her hand trembled. She touched the flame to the corner of the paper. They watched it together, watched the ink curl and blacken, watched her father's threats, her family's shame, her old life, turn to nothing but ash. When it was gone, Jeremiah took her chin, his hand gentle, tilting her face to his. His eyes were clear and certain. "You're not something bought or sold, Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're not a debt. You're not defined by what he did to you. You're not defined by what your family said." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "You're mine." She searched his eyes, the word mine still holding a lifetime of fear, property, possession. He saw it. He shook his head, a small, fierce movement. "No, not like a horse, not like this land." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers. "You're mine because you choose to be, and I'm yours, if you'll still have me. I choose you." "Jeremiah," she whispered, the words the most solid truth she had ever known. He kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of wood smoke and morning and the beginning of a life she had never, ever dared to imagine. The peace lasted for 3 weeks. It was a quiet, sun-drenched peace, a time when the valley felt like the entire world, and the outside, with its lawyers and its cruel definitions, was nothing but a bad dream. Clara and Jeremiah had settled into a new life, one built in the space between his bed and the morning sun. She had moved her things from the loft. There was no discussion. He had simply taken her pallet one morning, rolled it up, and stored it in the barn. Her clothes, few as they were, now hung on pegs near his. She slept beside him, woke beside him. She learned the shape of him in the dark, the way he breathed when he was asleep, the solid, warm weight of his arm draped over her waist. Their days were spent in the familiar rhythm of work, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was the comfort of knowing where the other person was without looking. It was the small, rough touch of his hand on the small of her back as he passed her in the narrow space by the stove. It was the way he watched her now, his eyes no longer hollow, but full of a quiet, possessive warmth that made her feel, for the first time in her life, beautiful. He was still a quiet man. He was still a man marked by grief, but the grief no longer owned him. He had made room for her. They were in the corral, mending a gate, the late afternoon sun hot on their backs. Clara was holding the post steady while Jeremiah set the new leather hinge. He grunted, pulling the strap tight, and she saw the muscles in his forearms bunch. She had been about to say something light about his smoking, which he had all but stopped, when the sound reached her. It was the rattle of a wagon. Not Mrs. Gable's slow, steady mare. This was heavy and fast, and accompanied by the sound of at least 3 horses. Clara froze. The hammer in her hand felt impossibly heavy. She looked toward the mouth of the valley. Jeremiah heard it too. He let the hinge go and straightened up, his hands shading his eyes. He did not move, but his whole body went rigid. "Clara," he said, his voice low and flat. "Go inside the cabin. Lock the door." "What is it?" she whispered, though she knew. "Go inside, now." But she could not. She was frozen. The wagon appeared, churning up a cloud of yellow dust. It was her father's wagon. Silas Croft sat on the bench, his face a mask of grim determination. Beside him sat Boone, the younger of the 2 men she had seen him with in town, and riding alongside the wagon, on a tall, mean-looking bay, was Hatcher, the man with the dead eyes and the gun tied low on his hip. They pulled up 20 yards from the corral, blocking the path to the house. Clara's blood turned to ice. The strength she had found in Jeremiah's arms, the courage she had felt in burning the letter, all of it evaporated. She was small again. She was useless. She was barren. She was property. She could feel the cellar stairs at her back. Jeremiah stepped in front of her. He did not run for his rifle, which was leaning against the cabin porch. He simply stood, a solid wall between her and them. "Silas," he said. His voice was calm, deceptively calm. "McAllister." Her father spat, not climbing down from the wagon. "I'm here for what's mine. You got my letter. You know the terms." "The terms are you have no terms." Jeremiah said, "The debt is paid. You have no business here." "I have every business." Silas sneered. "I'm here to reclaim my property. The contract is null. False representation." He finally looked at Clara, his eyes full of a cold disgust. "You sold me damaged goods, McAllister, and I'm here to take the flawed stock back. She ain't fit for marriage. She's returned." The words, spoken in the open air, were 1,000 times worse than they had been on paper. Returned stock, like a broken chair. "She's not stock," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "She's my wife." Clara's head snapped up. She stared at his back. He had not said those words before. Not to her. Her father laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Wife, you married it? You filed papers on a barren mule? You're a bigger fool than I thought. That don't make no difference. The original contract was fraudulent. She's mine to take, and I'm taking her." "You're not taking anyone," Jeremiah said. "You have 1 minute to turn that wagon around and get off my land, or I will remove you." Hatcher, the man on the horse, laughed. "You and what army, farmer?" "Just me," Jeremiah said. He took a step to the side, moving slowly. His eyes locked on Hatcher, but his body angling toward the cabin, toward his rifle. "Don't," Hatcher said, his hand dropping to his belt. "Don't be stupid." Silas Croft's face was purple with rage. He had come here expecting a quick, legal victory, or at least a negotiation. He had not expected this absolute iron refusal. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just steal from me?" "You've got it backward," Jeremiah said. "Now, get!" "Boone! Hatcher! Get her!" Silas roared, his composure breaking. "Get the girl! We'll tie her to the wagon if we have to." Boone hesitated, looking from Jeremiah's stony face to Hatcher. But Hatcher smiled. He liked this part. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his spurs jingling. Boone climbed down from the wagon, his hands clenching. "This is your last chance, McAllister," Hatcher said, walking forward slowly. "Step aside." "No," Jeremiah said. "Then we'll move you." Hatcher lunged. But Jeremiah had been waiting for it. He was not a town brawler. He was a man who survived. He sidestepped Hatcher's clumsy rush and drove his fist into the man's stomach. Hatcher let out a grunt of pained surprise. Clara screamed. Boone, seeing his chance, made a grab for her. She scrambled back, but he was fast. He caught the sleeve of her dress. "Come on now, girlie. Your pa's calling." "No, let me go!" she cried, pulling, the fabric ripping in his hand. "Stubborn, ain't she?" Hatcher grunted, recovering his breath. He was furious, his face dark. He advanced on Clara. "You're gonna learn to do as you're told. Don't you touch her," Jeremiah warned, moving to intercept him. But Boone still had a grip on her arm. Hatcher saw his opening. He ignored Jeremiah. He looked right at Clara, his eyes full of malice. He backhanded her. The sound was a sharp, wet crack that echoed in the yard. It was not a slap. It was a blow, meant to silence, meant to break. Clara's head snapped to the side. Pain exploded in her jaw. and she tasted the coppery tang of blood. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the world spinning. The yard went utterly, terribly silent. Her father, on the wagon, looked shocked. Boone let go of her arm, his hand frozen. Jeremiah had stopped breathing. He looked at Clara, on the ground, holding her face. He looked at the blood on her lip. He looked at Hatcher, who was breathing hard, his fist still clenched. When Jeremiah moved, it was not human. It was an avalanche. It was not a fight. It was an execution. He did not go for Hatcher. He took 3 long, fast strides to the cabin porch, seized his rifle, and turned. Hatcher, seeing the gun, fumbled for his own. "Now! Hold on!" Jeremiah did not raise the rifle to fire. He strode forward, his face a mask of pure, cold rage, and swung the heavy Winchester like an axe. He put his entire weight behind it, aiming the solid wood stock not at the man's body, but at his head. The sound of the thick, cured wood connecting with Hatcher's temple was not a crack. It was a dull, sickening thud, like an axe splitting a rotten log. Hatcher's eyes rolled back in his head. He did not make a sound. He simply collapsed, a boneless sack of clothes, and lay unmoving in the dust. He was out before he hit the ground. Jeremiah levered around into the chamber, the shuck-shuck of the mechanism impossibly loud. He pointed the rifle, not at Silas, but at Boone, who had his hands raised high, his face pale with terror. "Don't shoot," Boone stammered. I didn't. Jeremiah ignored him. He leveled the rifle at Silas Croft's chest. "I told you to get off my land." His voice was not a shout. It was a whisper. It was the most terrifying sound Clara had ever heard. You killed him," Silas stammered, his eyes wide on the unmoving form on the ground. "He's breathing," Jeremiah said, his voice flat. "But he won't be, and neither will you, if you are not gone in 10 seconds. This is murder! You can't— I'll have the law. I'll have you hanged." 10, Jeremiah said. He raised the hammer of the rifle. Silas scrambled to pull the wagon around, his hands shaking, the horses confused by his panic. "Boone, get him! Get Hatcher! Throw him in the back!" Boone, never taking his eyes off Jeremiah's rifle, dragged the unconscious man by his arms, his heels digging ruts in the dirt, and unceremoniously rolled him into the wagon bed. "This ain't over, McAllister!" Silas shrieked, his voice high with fear and rage. "You assaulted my men. You're holding my daughter. I'm bringing the judge. I'm bringing the sheriff. You'll see. You'll hang for this." He cracked the whip, and the wagon tore out of the yard, Boone clinging to the side, leaving Hatcher's hat in the dust. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of flies and Clara's own ragged, terrified breathing. Jeremiah stood, unmoving, the rifle still pointed down the road, until the wagon was just a speck of dust. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. He let out a breath that seemed to drain all the rage from him, leaving him trembling. He turned to Clara. She was still on the ground, her hand pressed to her bleeding mouth, her whole body shaking. He dropped the rifle and was at her side in an instant, kneeling in the dirt. He reached out, his hand, still shaking, hovering over her face. He was afraid to touch her. "Clara," he whispered, his voice broken. Are you—" She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. Not at the blow, but at the terrible, swift violence she had just seen unleashed on her behalf. "Jeremiah," she wept, and she fell into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, burying her bloody face in his shoulder. You... He crushed her to him, his hand in her hair, his other arm a band of iron around her waist. He held her, rocking her, his face buried in her neck. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick. "God, I'm sorry. I should have been faster." "No," she sobbed. He was going to take me." "Never," he said, his voice fierce, his grip tightening. "Never. I will never let him take you. I will kill him first. I will kill them all." She pulled back, her hands on his face. "No, no more killing. No more. He's bringing the judge." The terror returned. "Jeremiah, he's bringing the law. He said you'll hang because of me. It's all because of me." "It's not because of you," he said, his voice hard. He gently touched her split lip with his thumb, wiping away the blood. His eyes went cold again. "It's because of him. Let him bring the judge. Let him bring the whole damn town. It's time to finish this. Not with this." He glanced at the rifle. "With the truth." "The truth?" she whispered, terrified. "My truth?" "Our truth," he said. He stood, pulling her to her feet. He held her steady. "He wants to put this on display. He wants to shame you into coming back. He wants to shame me into letting you go. We won't let him." The ride to town was silent. They did not wait. After Jeremiah had cleaned her face and she had changed her ripped dress, he had hitched his own wagon. He did not wait for the judge to come to him. He was taking the fight to them. He drove the wagon, his rifle resting at his feet. Clara sat beside him, her hands clenched in her lap. Her lip was swollen, and a dark bruise was already forming on her cheek. Every person they passed on the road stared at them. When they arrived, the town was already buzzing. Her father had been there. The mercantile porch was full. People were gathered, talking in low, excited voices. Judge Elias Thorne was waiting for them inside the mercantile, which was serving as an impromptu courthouse. He was a tall, thin man with a stern, impartial face. The town sheriff, a man named Brody, stood beside him, his hand on his gun. Silas Croft was there, his face righteous and angry. Boone stood behind him, looking terrified. Hatcher was nowhere to be seen, likely being tended to by the doctor. The whole town piled into the mercantile. The women who had whispered were in the front row, their faces greedy. Mrs. Gable was there, too, standing at the back, her arms crossed, her expression grim. Mr. McAllister," the judge said, his voice booming in the crowded room. "Mr. Croft here has lodged a serious complaint. He alleges you are holding his daughter, Clara Croft, against her will. He alleges you assaulted him and his hired men when they came to peacefully retrieve her. He alleges, and Sheriff Brody's examination of his man, Mr. Hatcher, confirms that you struck him with a rifle with intent to kill." The room gasped. "This is in addition." The judge continued, "To his prior legal claim that his contract with you is null and void, based on false representation." He looked at Jeremiah. "This is a serious matter. What say you?" Jeremiah stood tall, his hat in his hands. He looked at the judge, but he spoke to the room. "I'm not holding her against her will." "She's afraid of him," Silas shouted. "He's a violent man. Look at her face. He probably did that to her himself." A new wave of whispers went through the crowd. Clara felt sick. Jeremiah's hand clenched. He took a deep breath. "I did not touch her. The man I struck, Hatcher, he hit her. He struck her because she refused to be taken. I defended her, as any man would." "He's lying," Silas yelled. "She's my property. The law says—" "The law," the judge interrupted, holding up a hand, "is what we are here to determine. This is a tangle. Let us first address the contract. Mr. Croft, you claim false representation. You claim the girl is unfit." "She's Barren," Silas shouted. "He paid for a wife, for a woman. He got a mule. I was swindled. The contract is void. I am taking her back." The judge looked at Jeremiah. "Mr. McAllister, is this your complaint? Were you deceived?" The room held its breath. This was the core. If Jeremiah agreed, she was lost. He would be refunded his debt, and she would be returned to her father like broken tack. Jeremiah looked at Silas, his eyes full of a cold contempt. "I have no complaint." Silas's jaw dropped. "What?" "I have no complaint," Jeremiah repeated, his voice clear and strong. "There was no deception. I knew her condition when the agreement was made." This was a lie, a beautiful, powerful lie, told to protect her. Clara looked up at him, her heart aching. "He's lying to protect his pride," Silas sputtered. "That is enough from you, Mr. Croft," the judge said. He turned his stern gaze to the last person in the triangle. "Miss Croft, you are at the center of this. You are a woman, not a sack of flour, despite how your father speaks of you. Are you with Mr. McAllister of your own free will?" Clara's throat was dry. Every eye in the room was on her face, on her shame. She could feel the stares of the whispering women, feel the pity of Mrs. Gable, feel the hatred of her father. She tried to speak. A small, squeaking sound came out. Jeremiah's hand, that big, calloused hand, came to rest on her shoulder. It was not a weight. It was an anchor. It was solid. It was steady. "Tell them, Clara," he whispered, so low only she could hear. "Tell them the truth." She took a breath. She looked at the judge. "My name," she said, her voice shaking, "is Clara." She paused, gathering herself. My father, he says I am barren. He says I am unfit. He is correct. I cannot have children." The women in the front row looked at each other, nodding, their suspicions confirmed. "But," Clara continued, her voice gaining a small, trembling strength, He does not tell you why." Silas took a step forward. "Girl, you hold your tongue. This ain't—" "You will be silent, Mr. Croft," the judge commanded, "or I will have you removed." Clara's eyes were fixed on the floor. She was back in the cellar. I was young. My cousin, a man from my own family, he tried to, he wanted things, and I said no. I fought him." The room was deathly quiet. You could hear a pin drop. He got angry." She wept, the words tearing from her, the shame of a lifetime pouring out. He pushed me. He pushed me down the cellar stairs. I fell. I was with child, his child." A woman in the front row gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I lost the baby," Clara sobbed, her body shaking so hard Jeremiah's grip on her shoulder tightened. I lost it on the dirt floor, in the dark, and the bleeding, it ruined me inside. An old woman, she said I was broken, that I was damaged." She looked up, her eyes full of tears, meeting the judge's. "My family, my father, they did not punish him. The man who did it, they punished me. They called me barren. They called me useless. They hid me, and they were ashamed of me." She finally turned, her swollen, bruised face plain in the light, and looked at her father. "And then, when his debts were too high, he sold me. He sold me like returned stock, because I was no use to him." She turned back to the judge. I did not deceive Mr. McAllister. I never deceived anyone. I was just trying to survive. I came here I expected nothing. I expected cruelty." She looked up at Jeremiah, her love for him, her gratitude, shining in her tear-filled eyes. He was kind. He is a good man, and I am here, of my own free will. Her voice was strong now. "I am not his property, and I am not my father's. I am his because I choose to be, and I will not go back." She finished, her chest heaving, her declaration hanging in the stunned, Heavy silence. Jeremiah's hand squeezed her shoulder, his pride in her a palpable thing. The judge stared at her for a long, long moment. The women who had whispered were weeping. Mrs. Gable was wiping her eyes. Judge Thorne cleared his throat. He turned his gaze, cold as steel, on Silas Croft. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice ringing with judicial fury. "You come in here, demanding justice. You speak of contracts and property." He slammed his hand on the counter. "You are a disgrace. You speak of false representation. The only fraud in this room is you. You abused this child. You allowed her to be, and then you blamed her for the sin. You cast her out and sold her for your own profit." He stood to his full height. "Here is my ruling. The contract, the payment of debt, is legally binding. Mr. McAllister paid you. She is, by the law of this territory, free of you and your household forever. The sale is final." "But the infertility," Silas stammered, his face pale. "I am nullifying any and all claims regarding restitution for infertility." The judge boomed. "There is no such clause in the law. It is nonsense. And I am condemning, in the strongest possible terms, the abuse this woman has suffered at the hands of your family." He pointed a finger at Silas. "You will not approach her again. You will not speak her name. You will not set foot on Mr. McAllister's property. If you do, Sheriff Brody will arrest you for harassment. Am I understood?" Silas Croft's face was a mask of pure, defeated hatred. He had lost. He had been publicly shamed, his darkest secret ripped open for the entire town to see. He looked at Clara, his eyes promising a hatred that would never die. He spat on the floor of the mercantile. "Get out," the judge said quietly. "Get out of my town." Silas turned and shoved his way through the crowd, Boone scrambling after him. The townsfolk parted for him, their faces full of disgust. The door slammed, and he was gone. The ride home was as silent as the ride in, but it was a different silence. It was the silence of a fever having broken. The air was clear. Clara leaned her head against Jeremiah's shoulder, her body exhausted, but light. The bruise on her face throbbed. The shame in her heart was gone. That night, they did not sit on the porch. They walked, hand in hand, to the small stand of aspen trees, and they looked at the stars, the same stars Mary had loved. But they were not her stars tonight, they were theirs. Clara stood in the circle of his arms, her back against his chest, his chin resting on her head. The night was vast, and she felt, for the first time, that she had a place in it. "They called me Barren," she whispered, her voice quiet in the immense silence. "For so long, I thought it meant I was empty." She turned in his arms to face him. She looked up at this quiet, strong man who had stood by her, who had given her his name when she had none. "But I feel full," she said, her hand coming to rest on her own belly. "Jeremiah, tonight, when I was standing there, I don't feel empty at all." He looked at her, his love for her so powerful it was a physical presence in the night. He did not say a word. He knelt before her, in the grass, under the stars. He put his hands, those large, rough, calloused hands, over her hand, on her belly. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her stomach. A soft, reverent kiss. He was not kissing the child he knew would never be there. He was kissing her. He was kissing her strength, her courage, her scars. He was kissing the woman he now called his heart. He rested his cheek there for a long moment, and she tangled her hands in his hair. He looked up at her, his eyes shining in the starlight. "You are," he whispered. "You are full. You're everything. Clara, you're my home." The months that followed the confrontation were a balm. The high, desperate heat of summer broke, giving way to the sharp, clean gold of autumn. The aspens in the high country turned to coins, and the air grew crisp. carrying the scent of curing grass and the promise of smoke. The valley, which had been a place of trial, became a sanctuary. Clara and Jeremiah settled into a rhythm that was all their own. It was a life built not on grand pronouncements, but on the small, sturdy bricks of daily, shared work. It was a quiet life, a rough life, but it was, in its very bones, a loving one. Their mornings began in the dark, in the warmth of the bed they shared. He would rise first, his heavy form sliding from the sheets, and his first act was always to tend the fire, coaxing the embers back to life. By the time she was dressed, he would have coffee on, the smell of it, strong and dark, filling the cabin. He would hand her a cup, his fingers brushing hers. A silent, good morning that held more than a dozen flowery speeches. They worked the ranch, preparing for the winter. They harvested the meager garden she had planted, her first attempt, and he built her new, sturdy root cellar doors. He was still a quiet man. His natural state was one of reserve. His thoughts held close, but his silence was no longer hollow. It was not the silence of a tomb, but the deep, comfortable quiet of the mountains themselves. It was the silence of a man who was at peace, who did not need to fill the air with noise to prove he was alive. Clara, in turn, learned to read him perfectly. She knew the hard set of his jaw meant he was worried about the hay lasting, not that he was angry with her. She knew the small, almost invisible quirk at the corner of his mouth was his version of a wide smile. She learned to lean into his quiet, to find her own peace within it. She had never felt more alive. The shame that had been her constant companion for a decade was gone, burned away in the mercantile fire and in the ashes of her father's letter. She was no longer the Barren girl. She was Clara McAllister. The first time she heard the name, spoken by the mercantile owner when they went for supplies, she had frozen. "That'll be $4.20, Mrs. McAllister," the man had said, his eyes kind. She had looked at Jeremiah, her face flushing. He had simply placed his large hand on the small of her back, a simple, possessive, and proud gesture. He paid the man, and as they walked out, he'd leaned down, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "It suits you." She had earned it. The town, which had once been a pit of vipers, had begun to see her. They had all been there. They had heard her story. They had seen her, bruised and trembling, stand up and speak a truth that would have leveled a lesser woman. They had seen her shame, and in doing so, they had been forced to see their own. The women who had whispered about the mule now nodded when she passed. It was a grudging respect at first, but it was respect nonetheless. Martha, the one who had been the cruelest, approached her by the feed store one day in October. "Mrs. McAllister," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. I heard your calf, the one you saved, is a fine young bull." "He is," Clara said, her voice even, not triumphant, just true. "He's got a strong back, stubborn, though." "Yes, well," Martha said, I wanted to say, my sow, she had a litter, but one is a runt. She won't take it. I was wondering if you knew any tricks for saving things." Clara looked at the woman. She saw the embarrassment in her eyes, but also a genuine plea. She could have been cruel. She could have reminded her of what she had called her. Instead, she thought of Stubbs, of the long night by the fire, of the simple, desperate need to protect something weak. "A little warm goat's milk mixed with a spoonful of molasses," Clara said, her voice soft. "Feed it with a clean rag every hour, and keep it warm, against your skin. If you have to, it's the warmth they miss as much as the milk." Martha stared at her, stunned by the simple, immediate kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." The story got around Mrs. Gable, who had become a staunch, if gruff, Allie was the one who told her. "You're getting a name, girl," she'd said, sharing coffee at their table. "They're saying you've got a hand with animals, that you're a healer." Clara had just shaken her head. I just don't like to see things given up on." Jeremiah, who had been listening from the porch, spoke into the quiet. "That's what makes you a healer, Clara." His pride in her was a tangible thing, a warmth that settled in her chest and never left. Their love was a rough-hewn thing, perfectly suited to the land they lived on. It was not gentle, but it was profoundly kind. It was in the way he would stop his work, wherever he was, when she brought him his midday meal, and sit with her for 10 minutes, just to share the silence. It was in the way she mended his old coat, the one he refused to part with, her small, neat stitches a testament to her care. And it was in their bed, in the dark, in the safety of his arms. She had finally, truly learned what it meant to be touched. He was a patient, tender lover, his large, rough hands map-making her body, learning her, adoring her. He had taken her brokenness, her shame, and her fear, and had, with his hands and his heart, made her whole. He had shown her that her body was not a source of shame, but a source of pleasure, a place of belonging. Winter came, hard and deep. The snows piled high, isolating them again. But this winter was not like the last. The cabin was not a tomb. It was a haven. It was a home. One day, he came with her to the aspen grove. The graves of Mary and Eliza were covered in a deep, clean blanket of white. He stood there, his hat in his hand, the wind cold on his face. Clara stood beside him, her gloved hand slipping into his. He looked at her, his eyes clear. The grief was still there, a scar he would always carry, but it no longer ate him alive. He held her hand, and he was a man standing with his wife, honoring his past, not trapped within it. The trip to town was necessary in late February. A blizzard had blown through, and they were low on flour and salt. The ride was cold, the wagon wheels crunching on the packed snow. The town seemed asleep, huddled under its white blanket, smoke rising in straight, gray columns from every chimney. As they tied the wagon at the mercantile, a strange sound cut through the frozen air. It was a thin, reedy cry, like a kitten, but more human. "What is that?" Clara asked, her head tilted. The sound was coming from the direction of the small, unpainted church at the end of the street. The preacher, Mr. Dobbs, was standing on the steps, wringing his hands, his face pale with panic. "Mr. McAllister," he called out, his voice high. "Thank the Lord. I don't know what to do." Jeremiah and Clara walked quickly toward him. On the top step, placed in a simple, woven basket, was a bundle of rags. The cry was coming from inside it. Someone just left it," Preacher Dobbs stammered. "Not 10 minutes ago. I heard the cry. I came out, and this—" Clara stepped past him, her heart hammering. She knelt in the snow. The baby was tiny, its face screwed up, its skin a dusky red from the cold. It was wrapped in a piece of worn deerskin. She pulled the skin back, and her breath caught. The child's features were unmistakable. His hair was thick and black. His eyes, squinted shut, were almond-shaped. He was half native. A few townsfolk had started to gather, drawn by the preacher's call. Martha was there, and the mercantile owner. "Lord have mercy," Martha whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. It's a half-breed." "Whose sin is this?" another man muttered. "Must be one of those trappers upriver." "What's to be done, preacher?" the mercantile owner asked, his voice full of distaste. It can't stay here. It should be sent to the reservation, or the fort. It's their problem." Clara looked at the child, her body vibrating with a sudden, fierce rage. They were talking about him like he was a stray dog, like he was Returned stock. He was discarded. He was unwanted. He was freezing to death, and they were debating whose problem he was. His story was her story. She didn't hesitate. She unpinned Mary's heavy blue shawl from her shoulders, the one she now wore as her own. She scooped the baby, basket and all, into her arms, and wrapped the thick wool around him, tucking him against her chest, against the warmth of her own body. The baby, sensing the heat, let out a small sigh, his cries quieting. She stood up, her eyes blazing. She looked at the preacher, at Martha, at the circle of staring, judging faces. "He's cold," she said, her voice shaking with a fury she had not known she possessed. "He's starving, and he's a child. He is not a problem." She turned to Jeremiah. He was watching her, his face unreadable. He had not moved. He was watching her, just as he had in the mercantile, waiting to see what she would do. His eyes were not on the baby. They were on her. This was the test. She knew it. To take in a child was one thing. To take in a half-breed was social suicide. It was to invite the very worst of the world's prejudice into their home. It was to become pariahs, truly and forever. She was his barren wife. She could not give him a son of his own blood. Now she was asking him to accept a son that the rest of the world despised. She held his gaze, her heart in her throat. She did not plead. She did not beg. Her look was a statement. This is who I am. This is what we must do. Jeremiah held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. He looked at the small, dark-haired head peeking from the blue shawl. He looked at the woman holding him, at her chin, which was set in that stubborn line he knew so well. He saw her strength. He saw her compassion. He saw his wife. He broke the silence. He stepped forward and placed his large, gloved hand on her shoulder, an echo of the day she had claimed her freedom. He faced the town. He faced the preacher. "Blood don't make a family," he said, his voice a low, clear rumble that cut through the cold air. "Love does." The town stared, stunned. He looked at the preacher. "This child is cold, and he needs a home. We have one. He needs a name. We'll give him one. As for whose sin this is," he looked around the circle, his gaze hard. "The sin ain't the child. The sin is leaving him to freeze on a church step." He turned his back on them all. He put his hand on Clara's arm. "Let's go home. Clara, our son is cold." They walked to the wagon. He helped her up, his touch impossibly gentle, his eyes on the small bundle she cradled. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and turned the wagon around. They rode out of town, leaving a cloud of stunned, absolute silence in their wake. The first few weeks were a trial. The baby, whom they named Samuel, was frail. He had been left in the cold for too long, his lungs weak. They fought for him. They fought together. They took turns, sitting by the fire, holding him, feeding him the warm goat's milk misses. Gable had brought by. She had been the first and only visitor. Arriving 2 days after they brought him home, she had stomped into the cabin, peered at the sleeping baby in his box cradle, and grunted. "You two are just collectors of strays, ain't you?" she'd said, her face severe. "A lame calf, a barren girl, and now this—" Clara had stiffened, but Mrs. Gable had just smiled. A rare, cracked leather smile. "Good for you. He's got a strong grip. He'll make it." She had left 2 quarts of milk and a bag of knitted woolens. Clara and Jeremiah fell into a new rhythm, the rhythm of parents. He would come in from the barn, his hands smelling of hay and horse, and his first move would be to check on the baby. He learned to change a swaddling cloth, his large, rough hands surprisingly deft. Clara, who had believed her body was a useless, broken thing, now found its purpose. She could not feed the child from her breast, but she could give him everything else. She held him against her skin, giving him the warmth she had told Martha about. She sang to him, low. Cracked lullabies she hadn't known she remembered. Her arms, which she had thought would be forever empty, were now full. Jeremiah watched her. He watched her transformation, the fierce, protective motherhood that had erupted in her. He saw the way she looked at the child, the pure, unadulterated love in her eyes, and his love for her, which he had thought was as big as it could be, deepened until it was an ocean. They raised him. They faced the whispers. When they went to town, people stared. They pointed. They called them the squaw man's family. But Jeremiah and Clara stood firm. They held their heads high. They had each other, and they had their son. They needed nothing else. Samuel grew. He was not a quiet child. He was loud and strong and full of a defiant life that mirrored the mountains. He had Jeremiah's steady gaze and Clara's stubborn chin. He was, in every way that mattered, theirs. One morning, 2 years later, Clara was in the cabin. It was early winter again, the first real snow dusting the yard. The cabin smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. It was warm. She looked out the window, wiping her floury hands on her apron. Jeremiah was in the yard. He was bundled in his heavy coat, between his legs, sturdy and thick in his own small woolens, was Samuel. The boy was just over 2 years old, a solid, tumbling force of nature. Jeremiah was holding his son's small, mittened hands. "That's it," she heard his low voice, muffled by the glass. "One foot, now the other. Come to me." He let go of one hand. Samuel wobbled, took a determined, lurching step on the snow, and fell, his bottom hitting the ground with a soft whump. He looked up at his father, his face getting ready to cry. Jeremiah did not rush to him. He knelt in the snow, his eyes level with the boy's, and he laughed. It was that wonderful, rusty sound, a sound she heard every day now. "That was a good fall," he said. "Best one yet. Now, up. Let's try it again. You can do it." He held out his hands. Samuel, his tears forgotten, giggled, grabbed his father's fingers, and hauled himself back up. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand over her heart. The wind was cold on her face, the same cold wind that had greeted her here a lifetime ago. The mountains were just as stark, just as unforgiving. The world had not changed, but she had. She looked at the man in the yard, his broad back a fortress, his head bent toward the child he had claimed with love. She thought of the woman she had been, the terrified, useless, discarded girl who had arrived here with nothing but a bag of old clothes and a lifetime of shame. The wind was still cold outside, but inside the cabin it was warm. She had a home, she had a name, and she had a man and a son who chose her every single day. She, Clara McAllister, once unwanted, once broken, once barren, was finally, completely, and miraculously home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We hope it brought a little warmth and strength to your day. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and say hello. For more stories from the untamed heart of the American West, please subscribe to From Wild West, and feel free to share your thoughts on Clara and Jeremiah's journey.